Here we are. All right, welcome all. And so today my talk is on internet tools for academic dishonesty, implications for course management and design. I'm really going to focus mostly on Chegg.com, a little bit of GPT. So talk about different ways in terms of setting upfront policies, policing, or just designing assessments that aren't going to eliminate, but will hopefully minimize. And I'm not used to this two things. So. Oh, previous. Back.
Crystal left should go. Okay.
There we are. All right. So there's a ton of opportunities on the internet that we're just kind of focusing here. So I have AI, obviously, is on the forefront of everyone's mind. John and I just had a depressing lunchtime conversation about our issues with AI. Searchable repositories of content. So Course Hero and Study Blue are two good examples of that. Answer services. And this is really Chegg.com is more than just a repository. It's an answer service that can answer questions within minutes as well. Tools to get around plagiarism detection, some paraphraser tools and things like that. Just real-time collaboration when you're pushing out exams online. Students have a group meet or a Discord server where they're really kind of helping each other in real time. And of course, ringers and essentially hiring somebody to take an asynchronous online class is also a condition. If we taught at a university with a higher economic profile, I'd probably be a bit more concerned about the last one than I am. But I'm really just going to focus on two in our 50 minutes together today. I'm going to talk a little bit about Chegg.com and some issues with AI platforms as well. So a little bit about Chegg.com, those of you that don't know. So Chegg.com has many features. It started as a used textbook purveyor, right? And it really became, they have, alleged tutoring services and different things like that. But really here it solves uploaded problems and questions. And a $20 a month subscription is allowing the user to post about 20 questions per month.
17, I think.
No, I think it's 1995. It's risen, yeah, inflation. So, yeah, so it's now up to about $20 a month, and students can actually upload, and they can upload as an image file, or they can upload it as text. And it posts the searchable database of prior solved questions. So once it's uploaded up there and no one removes it, it's there for posterity as well. So most publisher content, the solutions are there. In fact, Chegg actually has solvers for a lot of the top selling textbooks, where they've already gone through and done step-by-step solutions to them across disciplines as well. They also offer some other tutoring and writing assistance to check for plagiarism, grammar, etc. So, but the whole uploading and answering of questions has been sort of the bane of my existence in these experiences. And then the AI text generators, we have the free versions and paid versions, right? And you do get what you paid for. The paid versions are much nicer than the free. John, I know, has the paid version. I've been slumming it with the free version, and that's been depressing enough, so save me some money.
Although on Edge, you can get the free version as a sidebar tool.
Mm-hmm. So obviously AI generated content is not really traceable. There are detectors out there. They just don't work perfectly enough. They can't really be your basis for academic dishonesty charges, etc. And so it does present a lot more serious of an issue. The good news is AI seems to be the Chegg slayer. So that's just a nice little graphic of Chegg stock price. Hate to see it. Yeah. So in the past month. So basically this cliff is there was an earnings report, an earnings call. And basically the CFO just admitted that AI was really cutting into their business model.
Hey Liz, we can't see the screen. I don't know if you're trying to share one.
Oh, because you shared only the browser. Share the whole screen.
I don't know how to share. Like, I'm very confused.
Okay, exit from the share.
Okay.
And then go back to that taskbar and then share a screen.
Okay. All right.
Share a screen and then choose screen 2, I think it is at the bottom. The arrow, yeah, screen 2.
Okay, I'm gonna try this one more time. How about that?
It's beautiful. Thank you.
All right. Well, then you didn't miss my graphic, so I really have to share with you. Chegg shareholders loss in value. So I'll have a moment of silence for that. So this was the good news, right? Is that Chegg is a bit more limiting, and Chegg is traceable, and as I'll talk about in a little bit, it's not as traceable as it was, but the idea is, you know, AI is harder to kind of trace or pinpoint. Designing to harness AI as a tool, there's a typo, rather than a substitute, is a lot more challenging, especially in large enrollment courses. So a lot of advice that exists out there about AI, and it said, well, this is your wake-up call. You have to make assignments more authentic, and maybe if you designed a better assignment, that this wouldn't happen, which is super helpful. But here's the thing, that does not scale. So a lot of the advice for AI that I'm going to take to a class that I have 20 people in the fall, I cannot use in a class of 170 people and still keep my sanity. So I'm going to really focus on, again, in the size of this presentation, I've got 2 areas to discuss today: course policies and management, online exam, and assignment design as well. It is concerning how many colleagues I have with syllabi that just default to and link to the school's policy. And that's really, it covers you, but it's really not sufficient. You should be telling students, this is how you're graded, and this is what constitutes dishonesty in the grading and evaluation of the course. Right? So you want clear guidelines, checking for violations regularly, protecting your intellectual property, and designed grading work in order to minimize how effective it would be to engage in dishonesty. So let's talk about each one of these in turn. So clear guidelines about academic dishonesty and consequences. So the college policy is required, but I strongly recommend you think about, how am I evaluating people in the course and what constitutes cheating? Because I'm very specific about it, and my Chegg conversations of this past semester said, well, I had no idea that it was cheating. Like, well, did you read this paragraph that says using Chegg.com? Yeah, because that's what that meant, that using it is not allowed, when I said it was not allowed. And so, those conversations get cut short and things like that. But it's be very specific about what resources are allowed, what resources are not allowed, right? The kind of punishments, we're given a lot of leeway in this university. We have suggestions about level of offenses and the appropriate punishments. And so you should be thinking about being very clear with students about that as well. And I often repeat them with instructions. And then one of the first assignments, they often have to affirm the policy. So I kind of copy and paste that syllabus policy in a question, and they have to answer, they have to sort of affirm that they have read that. So the whole idea is, I didn't read your syllabus, so I didn't know it wasn't okay to use Chegg. And why would I know that asking someone else to answer a question and passing it off with my own would actually be dishonest? I had no way of knowing that. No way at all. All right. So here's one of my ideas of my latest iteration of the syllabus this past semester. I talked about, academic dishonesty. I said, basically your work needs to be your own, that you're representing to me that you understand, or you're on your way to meeting the learning outcomes of this course, you as a person. And so when is your work not your own? And I give some examples, and this is a little bit of a condensing for the slide. But I talk, when you copy without quotes or citations, you're suggesting that it's your content, that it's your original content. And of course it's not. And so building on other knowledge is great, but you have to acknowledge that the knowledge that was created before you. Using answer sites like Chegg, I mentioned it by name. Using AI to generate responses, using the work of others, and then being careful about understanding what's that, these children that have grown up in the internet, full on in the internet, don't necessarily understand that something's out there or something's there, and they just can't take it and use it because it's there. They were allowed to access it, so it must belong to them in some place. And so it is kind of important to talk about intellectual property and the importance of that property. I basically come up with a system. It can seem really daunting at first that I can't check possibly every question I have. I've been dealing with Chegg for years now. So I kind of have a system that even right before I deploy some kind of assignment or writing prompt, I'll check again really quick. I'll check during as I'm grading by question in assignments as well. Sometimes even after. Our colleague in economics, Glenn Graham, has this recurring problem of students posting the answer key on Chegg, which means he's graded all of the assignments, handed them back, gave them an answer key for reference, and then they post the answer key, which is like, well, I guess they're just like paying it forward. They're very thoughtful group in Glenn's class. But grading by question can be really effective because that's when you notice patterns and odd responses. So Chegg.com has a disturbing amount of quality with some of my courses and their answers, but not always. And so sometimes they just really get it wrong, or they use a vocabulary we've never used in class, or a solution method that we've never used in class. That's technically correct, but not really the one we used. And that begins to sort of think about it as well. And then remember, file the reports. And this is a conversation I have with too many colleagues, and I'll leave it to Paul and the associate deans to talk about it at their session, but there's just too many academic dishonesty kind of handled in-house and not reported. And repeat offenders get away with saying, I've never done that, I won't do it again, blah, blah, blah. More bad news is Chegg used to have this honor code investigation. And with the honor code investigation, you would get the email of the account holder, you would get the IP address that it was submitted from, you would get the date timestamp of when it was submitted and the date timestamp that the answer came. But because they're super concerned about their clients' privacy, because that's Chegg, always looking out for us, they were super concerned about their clients' privacy. So the honor code now just gives you date timestamps. It's not really that helpful. It can be helpful if you've narrowed down to who must have posted it. The date timestamps can help you out because they can, if they were posted before someone opened up an assignment, then that they didn't do it, or things like that. So the honor code right now is kind of barely worth the work. But if you're in class, I have a template ready to go. I'm happy to share. They've got Paul's Tomasic's signature on it, and it's just ready to go. You just fill in the class and stuff. They do get back to you quickly. I will say that. The other thing I have to give Chegg credit for is that they do actually respond, usually within 24 hours these days, to telling them to take down my stuff. Right. And so there's a Chegg online form, or you can do it in a PDF form. Right. And I saved what I did with the online form is I saved kind of the form in terms of autofill in my browser. So it's I usually just have to copy in the URLs about that as well. And again, if your questions aren't Chegg, you don't need a subscription for them to pop up in a search. You will need a subscription to see the answers, right? And if you want them, you can just email me because I took the hit and I have the subscription. So I've become the repository of Chegg answers for most faculty. So you submit and they actually take them down. These have to be questions that you wrote. Keep in mind that you don't own the publisher content. And so you don't have any standing to ask Chegg to take down publisher content as well. So let's think a little bit about exam design. And so I think one of the biggest things I've done, the pandemic certainly helped me go even further with this, is thinking about whether or not any one thing in the class should be high stakes. The higher the stakes, the greater the incentive is to get help, right? And I'm asking people to think about, do you need to use high stakes exams? And that's really dictated by a course, a discipline, and a class size as well. The same with other alternative kinds of assessments. Well, could you do a podcast or things like that? Again, in a class of 30, that's really something you want to think about. In a class of 170, although John does that because it's insane, but not everyone's as insane as John. So that you can't really rely on that. Types of questions. My questions have turned to emphasis on process, referencing and prior work. In an online class, if I have a discussion, I'll often follow up the following week, and there'll be a question where they have to reference the discussion in order to address the topic, right? And Chegg's not going to be able to do that. And frankly, neither is an AI generator. It's not going to be able to reference a prior discussion post as well. Emphasis on really current examples. Like in economics, those abound. So, if I use an example for money and banking or macroeconomics from this year, it gets a lot harder to find to get a good answer on with either AI or with Chegg. Building around a visual is another one, right? And AI's gotten a lot better, but depending on what version of AI that students are using, building around a visual, making them create a graph in economics and actually go from there makes it a lot harder to do well by using an AI generator as well. Staging work is another thing that foils these kind of issues. So you don't just want the end product, you want to see the process, you want to see reflection on the process. Peer critiques are another way to actually go in and really disrupt how much of a grade can be weighted from these things. Referencing has been a big one. So I often they have to reference specific models and notation in the course as well. And again, because one giveaway is some notation in certain fields is standard and you'll see it everywhere. But sometimes there can be some unique notation used in the text, in the reference text you're using for the course. And what can happen is the giveaway becomes when they actually default to a different notation. And that's usually the first sign that they're actually passing off work done elsewhere as their own as well. When I say current examples, I mean current examples. So I mean, talking about 2020 and the pandemic is probably too old by now. So, but talking about creating a question around the Silicon Valley Bank was one way I could actually do it. Talking about, the potential default on United States Treasury debt upcoming is another one as well. I'm just going to understand publisher question banks have been a real lifesaver and a time saver. They're a real way to operationalize retrieval practice. When you want to give students a lot of practice, writing good questions is really hard. We all know this in this group. And publisher question banks are a help, but publisher question banks are almost entirely on a site like Chegg.com. Any major selling economics textbook, almost the entire Pearson or Cengage or Macmillan or McGraw-Hill test bank is on there, right? And there has been, with inclusive access, people sort of get the ebook and the companion homework guides, right? And the codes. And so there's widespread usage of it, but quizzing scores that come from it really need to be taken with a grain of salt, and you want to weight accordingly. So maybe you think doing those would be really good practice for an exam where you're using your original content. So do it. So set them up and weight it accordingly. Don't weight it as 25% of the grade. One of the things in terms of pinpointing who is uploading my material from Chegg and just making it a lot more difficult and making collusion a lot more difficult are question pools. And this is for our younger faculty, this becomes a big issue, but when you've taught for a long time, you have some larger pools of your own content. Again, content that I own, that I developed. And when they draw from the pool for each question, you have a set of 4 questions that drew from 10 possible, right? So now you have 1/10 to the 4th probability of getting the draw of questions, right? And then when you find someone pasted on Chegg those same 4 questions, you pretty much know who did it in a class, right? And then you begin to have that conversation. So question pools help pinpoint who's kind of compromising your test items and your intellectual property. And it becomes a deterrent once you have these conversations, word gets out, and it becomes a deterrent for future as well. You can further leverage question pools in disciplines where you have calculated formula questions, where you basically set the parameters of the numbers and it draws them randomly. So I can have calculating the inflation rate from the consumer price index. I can set up like a million possible options, in terms of drawing from a distribution about the beginning, consumer price index, the end, and what the inflation rate is. Those unique numbers, again, help you pinpoint who is using these resources. Because, if there's a million options numerically for a question and one of them pops up on Chegg, it's just not that hard to track down where it came from as well. I think this one is timing is harder, time to not to time. I can tell you, I've been teaching online asynchronously since 1999. And at first I didn't time things. I felt, early in the years, online was really extending the opportunities of education to people who had barriers, and that I didn't want to create further barriers if timing wasn't really necessary. But some of my assessments have tilted to having the time. I just have to, given the kind of tools that are out there. And scrambling can be really important too. The scrambling and the order also limits the ability to collude in addition to posting. And scrambling and the order of questions then is also another way to pinpoint who's compromised the integrity of an exam or another assessment. One of the ways I've compromised about that is I pulled apart the tests. So consider having 2 to 3 parts of the final exam, for example, as separate tests, separately timed. So you have part 1, part 2, part 3. They take them in any order. They take them in a 24-hour window, and the timer starts when they open it. And that allows people to take a part, then to stretch, take a break, get a beverage, whatever, and then come back and take a different part as well. And it's a way to make it, I think, more inclusive too. In an online class, you have parents with small children at home, and that way they have to find smaller chunks of time to be able to have the sole focus on the test. So pulling out different parts and separately timing them can be a way to sort of compromise timing for security versus barriers as well. I would just note, when you're timing a fully online exam, the rules about how much time per question have to be reconsidered. So it used to be the kind of rule of thumb in a multiple choice question in class is about 1 minute per question. Like you could ask a 50 question multiple choice in a 55-minute Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. That would be considered reasonable amount. Some people would always have time. Some people would have a hard time finishing with that, but most people would. But the research is kind of in its infancy. I wouldn't call it conclusive, but most of the research about this suggests that reading comprehension for screen is slower or worse than in person. The best case scenario, it's neutral, but I don't know of any research that says reading comprehension for a screen is better. Put it that way. So you want to consider more generous timing per question than an in-class exam. So if you have a 55-minute class and you have an exam of a certain length and type that has worked in that class, consider that it might be, if you time it the same way, you might run into problems as well. So I probably time it about 2 minutes per multiple choice question if I'm using them, right? So I've almost doubled the timing on a lot of different kinds of questions that I ask. This one has been, I think, more controversial, and I've done it both ways. Students hate one question at a time. So the idea of one question at a time is, as the title suggests, you actually get one question on your screen, you answer that question, and you move on in the test, and you cannot backtrack. Right? You can't, if another question kind of triggers something, oh, I did that wrong, you can't go back and change your answer. And if you have a randomized pool, right, again, it makes colluding very hard, if not impossible, really, because you can't go back and forth. Students are getting different questions at different stages in their exam. And unless you have really rapid Chegg response time from new questions that you've written, it's also going to make it very difficult, because if they spend too much time on one question, they run out of time for the exam. They can't wait for Chegg to answer and come back later, right, under this design. It makes the exam harder. And I mean, one argument is, this is the format I do for exam security. I know it makes it harder, and I adjust the distribution to reflect for the fact, by design, this exam has become harder. And it's the trade-off. And I just think it's important to be transparent with your students about this trade-off, right? This is about exam security, and you really kind of make it an equity case. If students have connections that allow them to get help that other students aren't allowed to get, you have an equity issue. So, doing an exam with some sort of security is a way to ensure this kind of equity in terms of what you're measuring. And then students that need extra time, we have, our old and new current learning management system have always allowed those kind of accommodations as well. And then I like Brightspace also doesn't, when you do a multiple choice, it doesn't automatically upload it to the gradebook. You can wait, and you can tell it to do it later. And so you could actually hold back the ability to review exam. Again, if you're giving tests in a window of 24, 48 hours, it's important to let them all come in and then give full feedback. You don't want to be giving feedback as they come in, to allow that kind of communication as well. So you want to be careful about that range of settings. John and I were just talking about this at lunch. We still hate proctoring software. I guess we understand why some people feel compelled to use it a little bit more after recent experiences, but I still hate it quite a bit. I think proctoring software is very gameable. I think some of the low levels of proctoring software of settings of browser lockdown basically favors anyone who has another device. Right? If you have 2 devices, that lockdown is worthless.
It's a waste of time and it's inequitable.
It is. And then if you start upping it, the cameras that just scan the room and the facial recognition, I mean, they just creep me out, people. It really creeps. So how can I expect my students to do it if just talking about it creeps me out as well? I found when people just switched to proctoring like that during the pandemic, there were a couple issues with students where I had to intervene because they had bandwidth issues, because everyone in their neighborhood, and some of these proctoring softwares that you have to load on your computer take CPU. They can really throttle what's going on and cause all kinds of problems as well. So and it's just, you take precautions as a principle, but proctoring software for every individual student becomes a personal situation to them. It's you saying, I don't trust you. I'm going to start with the presumption that you're going to do things that you're going to be dishonest. It's always the way I felt it, and I'm just so far it's been a bridge too far. So we'll see. Stay tuned. Least common denominator continues to plummet, as they say on The Onion. So we'll see. AI is just, it's just a lot more challenging. It's just not traceable with the way Chegg is. Using kind of my own design or my own original content isn't a way to thwart it or detect it very easily as well. So here are some strategies, none of which are foolproof. Now, I was just going to say, I think AI has tremendous potential, and will be. I know there's a class that's going to be about writing prompts and how to use it. And I think there's some great ways to incorporate it, right? But you really have to think back and change the kind of questions I asked. And I admitted to John with the lift of Brightspace from spring of 2022 to spring of 2023, I just didn't have the time to try and AI proof some of the things that I asked students to do. And boy, does it show. Right? So I don't know who's DQing, Paul, but don't blame me. It wasn't in my class. All right. Anyhow. So you want to harness, there's a way to harness AI for the assignment, right? Brainstorm, sometimes students have the hardest time choosing topics for things like that. And say, okay, well, I want you to use ChatGPT, have it suggest some topics, bring them to class, we'll get in small groups, we can talk about it, and you can think about things like that. Again, personal reflections for the prompt or assignments. One of my favorite discussion posts is I ask people to do a personal reflection, and then there's lines like, as an AI text bot, I don't really have personal reflections. But I'm like, come on.
They were using the early version.
Yes, they're using the
4
free.
will generate personal reflection.
Right. Well, I mean, students are going to be, our students might gravitate to the free, not as good ones. Others will.
Except that version 4 is available on Edge now for free. So
are our students using
people, they can.
Yeah.
Especially
Okay.
if they know it's free rather than
Well,
$20
maybe
a month.
we'll wait for that to get around. Yay.
I would say a lot of them, based on my own kids' experience, if they had those like high school Chromebooks, Edge is what it comes with.
Nice.
So they will be using Edge, even though nobody else does.
That's changing.
Yeah. Sometimes local community reference and very recent events as well. So again, the AI doesn't always catch up to very recent events, not just like recent, but really recent, or a community. If you can find something from the Syracuse area, if I can use a reference of Micron to talk about economic impact or local economic multipliers, it's just a topic in macro.
The training base is only up until November of 2021, and that's going to be true through GPT-5.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, the oral presentations, annotations, podcasts, things like that. Again, they can get assistance. They can actually ask a script or an outline of a podcast. They can ask ChatGPT to do these things and other AI bots. But some of that amount, they're just going to have to do themselves. They're going to have to actually record the podcast or in the oral presentations in class or by video, for example. I know Jim Early, we were just having breakfast this morning, and he had instituted in his computer classes that they did actually he had scheduled meetings. And again, he had a class size that allowed this, that they would come for short meetings weekly and they would talk about what they did in an assignment in a program or whatever. and talk them to their thinking. And that was a big part of the project, right? Because people who were using the help of AI were not able to explain what they did and why and what they were thinking very well as well. Stages, although you can use help with the stages. John had a particularly ambitious student that actually decided what paper he was going to cheat with early on and then just used it to
backwards
stage
design for
everything.
the whole
So
semester.
John was very upset, but I told him he could respect the hustle just a little bit because I feel there's some respect due for that. That person was determined not to learn anything in that course. You know, again, analyzing images is my big thing is in macro, I can ask students to create. We have a graphing utility from the Federal Reserve that graphs time series. So I can ask them to create in that tool, right? So they can try and say, show me a graph of inflation and get me one that was created somewhere else, and that's not gonna work. So they have to create it. You can fool around with different time periods. You can give students different ones based on time periods from a pool. But you create that image and then tell you what does that image mean, or what is the policy implications? So based on this, the current inflation trend, what would be your policy recommendation for monetary policy or something like that from the graph that they had to create? It's not that you can't use AI to help you with that assignment, but if you totally rely on AI, you're just not going to be able to do well on that assignment either as well. And then student follow-up. If you think someone's student did AI, have a talk about it. That doesn't mean you're going to be able to prove it or you're going to end up with an academic dishonest report or anything like that. But I was kind of stunned in my class. I know Ranjit had a few people in US economic history. He's like, you know what? I think you used an AI bot on this. You haven't really addressed the prompt, and it's, you know, it's not really making sense with what I asked you to write about. And they both just said, yeah, you're right. I won't do it again. I'm like, oh, okay. Didn't know that would work, but all right. It really is going to be helpful to be on the same page as the rest of your department. All right. And this is, you know, and Jim and I bemoaned this too, is that sometimes it's just really demoralizing when you spent time in course design and enforcement, or, you know, in Maxient filling these things out, to know that your colleagues just don't want to be bothered. Your colleagues are letting it go because they don't want to look for it, because if they look for it, they might have to do something about it. And it helps, you know, it can help a whole department if there's some consistency about the department has decided this kind of behavior is not acceptable, or this is, and there are consequences. You can expect consequences as well. You know, before Chegg had been kind of supplanted by AI, I used to pressure textbook vendors a lot and say, why would I make students pay $100 for this package that's entirely uploaded to Chegg? He's like, well, you can see how your students are doing. I'm like, no, I can see how many students have a $20 monthly subscription to this place. It's like, you know, your bread and butter is marketing this property, this intellectual property you created for me to use. And if you're not going to protect it, then it's not monetized. You know, for you, some of you may know, Chegg's in the middle of a lawsuit from their shareholders based on misrepresenting themselves, saying that they were like this tutoring site when they were really a cheat site. So their share price soared during COVID, right? And then it plummeted when people went back to a lot of in-class activity. And so the shareholders feel like Chegg misled them, and they're suing them about it. But I guess it's always surprised me that the textbook publishers have not been more aggressive, because I think it has kind of diminished their business model. And people like, might as well go to OER, because why would I make them pay for something that they're just going to use, you know, and then pay for the subscription to Chegg or whatever as well. Yeah, and there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of more discipline-specific designs of alternative assessments. But again, I do think the conversation is, I don't like the way the conversation is kind of turned, where people say, I don't know what to do about this AI thing. It's like, well, maybe you should think, maybe if you wrote better assignments or things like that. They just don't scale, right? You know, there's a large part of education at larger universities, and even to something in Oswego, where you have classes with over 100 students. And when you have classes with over 100 students, some of the alternative or more authentic assessments you might like them to do become kind of difficult to manage, do that and do as well. So that's where I am. Any questions? No. It's kind of cheery, right? It's all good. I mean, I think we have, and this is, some of your colleagues will say, well, if they're going to cheat themselves out of an education, then why should I care more than they do? And again, I mean, that's a convenient argument because it really lets the instructor off the hook in course design, in course discipline. And, you know, particularly at a public university, right, you have some kind of responsibility here in terms of a subsidized education and what that subsidized education is giving to, you know, you make an argument about what students get out of college and why it's valuable for a society to subsidize that. And academic integrity enforcement, being aware of the tools, not only kind of deals with that part, you know, ethically, but I also think it does make you really think about what do I want them to learn and how can I measure their learning versus somebody else's.
So I had the experience this semester for the first time, and this isn't a low stakes assignment, right? So, and it's intro to political theory. So the most recent theorist we read was a book that came out in 1997. So there's nothing new. I mean, so anyway, the assignment that I've had them do is for each of the philosophers that they read, they have to do a reading response. And I noticed that when I just graded the final one, which is the book from 1997, where their summary of the book had sentences like, critics of Mills argue and I'm like, oh no, like there's no critics of Mills, like you need to like read this one chapter of the racial contract, and that's what your so like it was low stakes, and it was pretty like, and I can't really do I mean, unless I'm asking, I mean, I asked them to like do a reflection on it, and the reflections were not good. And so I was like kind of graded it down, but I'm not really sure. Like I couldn't, you know, I tried like Googling the sentence, and
Sure.
of course, like nothing comes up. So I'm kind of at a loss of where to, unless we just scrap that assignment completely and have them do.
I think, well, I don't think you just have to scrap it, but I do think there are ways you can pivot that prompt where they're gonna miss, if they use an AI text, how are they gonna miss substantial parts of the prompt, and have a rubric that's really graded heavily on addressing the prompt, so that students could get by maybe, but they're not gonna do well if they're farming it out. And
And
then,
if you could make connections to applications of it to something current or something in the reading,
Mhm.
or something in a video or something to compare and contrast that reading with.
if you had a really recent
Mhm.
event and you would say, how did Mill's theory?
How would Mill respond? to that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. But I'm gonna have to tell them it would have to be like from the last 2 months or something. Right, because there are like
Yeah,
racialized killings all the time, and I don't want them to
and
go.
that's, you know, and it's more, it becomes more work too, but I think one of the things is I came up with the different, so I have, you know, I'll have a prompt and I use it in the quiz part of Brightspace, but I'll have like 6 prompts that could deal with that reading and 6 different current events, and they'll randomly draw one, so not even all your students will relate it to the same event.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and then, so yeah, on the part where they might have to summarize Mill, you know, they're all gonna
Yeah.
be amazing, so good, perfect, grammatically correct, everything, right? But the
Yeah.
prompts where they really have to link it, and those you weight those heavier.
Grace has a comment in chat.
Lisa, we see that once in a while for our interview of professor paper, they take information from faculty that have bios in text online and make up the rest. Rest is when they reference a professor that is not as Oswego, but has the same name. Well,
And to be fair, ChatGPT will make up stuff. If it doesn't-
Yes, yeah.
If it doesn't have information in the database.
yeah, in fact, David Andrews' wife was giving a talk at Columbia. She's a religious studies professor at Lemoyne. And the Columbia grad student introduced her using a quote that he attributed to her that she never ever wrote. And so he clearly went on ChatGPT and like asked for a quote from her, because she's like, I've never said that in my life.
Yeah, I
I
really.
mean, she didn't call him out, but when she got back, she told David that.
Wow.
Liz, I like the fact that you're transparent with students about why you make the choices you make in setting up exams. I think that all too often students, you know, the students who aren't cheating are, you know, they really want to backtrack, but they can't, and they get pissed off about that. And I think that the fact that you're upfront and say, look, if I had my choice, I would let you do this. I think it's better to do it the other way, but I can't because of the whole cheating thing. I think that that is something that is just good for everyone. And it's.
I do, and I think you can compromise. You can offer them an exam wrapper that allows them to go back to that exam afterwards
Yep.
and find something they miss and kind of correct it and talk about it. And that adds points back to their exam.
Yep.
So it kind of allows to correct for the fact that the distribution is probably shifted downward because of one question at a time. I think a lot more students claim that they go back and fix their answers than actually do it. So I also feel that they don't like the fact that they can't, but I'm not sure that they actually do when they have the power to. If you actually track, if you look at.
Well, the one issue is, even if it's not something they routinely do, sometimes a later question will prompt
do.
recall of material that they already answered, and they can't go back and change it or fix it.
No, that's very true. But an exam wrapper can give them the opportunity to try and earn back points that way as well.
When you grade the exam wrapper, is it like a hand?
So the exam
written-
wrapper, I usually actually is just usually like a written response kind of quiz
Assignment
that
or
I,
something,
that I tag as bonus, right? But they have to pick, they pick a question, you're right, they have to pick a question that they missed. And they have to, expound on it, and you can do however many questions are corrected or things like that about it. And it's not.
Give them a quarter or a half the points
right,
back.
and and item analysis too, you can kind of, you can pull up if you got two monitors too, and you can figure out whether or not they made up a question that they didn't actually miss or something like that. But I mean, it's honestly, it's a no-brainer of an activity that, I'm not, and it's always been my preference that if an exam is lower, that, if they haven't done as well on an exam, I don't tend to just want to shift the distribution. I'd like to know why they didn't, and kind of devise a wrapper assignment that addresses it, that addresses what went wrong.
What I've often done, although I'm moving away from multiple choice tests, which is a question I have to address before the fall,
Yeah,
is I've given 2 attempts with random drawing.
Yep.
So they can take an attempt, get the score, and if they see they're doing poorly, I don't show them the correct answers, but at least they can see where they were having trouble. And then they could go back and try another attempt
Sure.
after reviewing the material.
when you have a large pool, that's the other way. You could say, I'm gonna do one question at a time, but I'm actually gonna give you 2 or 3 attempts and take the highest. And that's another kind of compromise you offer them as well. And again, you'd be
Are you supposed to
transparent,
take the highest? Yeah.
just randomly take one based on a sine wave transformation. That's how John did it. It's very intuitive. Yeah. And so I mean, I think that's, and you said be transparent about the trade-off, about, I'm gonna allow you this that makes it easier or maximizes your score, takes the best of it, while at the same time, I have security options that can make the test a little bit more difficult as well.
But ChatGPT is extremely good at multiple choice. In fact, on the test of understanding college economics, in the micro version at least, it's at a 99th percentile now.
Well, it's past, the multiple choice forms of MCATs, GREs, LSAT.
Yeah, well, and also, some law board exams, bar exams, MBA exams and so forth. Any questions?
All right. Well, thank you for stopping in, and if anyone wants, I kind of went through that PowerPoint, but if anyone wants it, you know my email. So Elizabeth.Schmitt@Oswego. Happy to send it to anyone.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, John.
Good seeing you.
Stop recording.
Yep.